So when we think about sharing news like that around a diagnosis, obviously it's an important conversation to have with your child, and how we frame things does have a bearing on how they receive that news. So it's good to think about the way we explain things to them, and I'm going to talk through some strategies now about how to do that. So when we are thinking about what way this news is going to land for your child, oftentimes parents are surprised that the reaction they get isn't what they expect, in that a child has already identified that they have a difficulty or they're finding things a bit more challenging in some areas than others. So when we sit them down and explain to them about their diagnosis, often they're not surprised, and actually it gives them a way to better frame or understand some of their own experiences. For example, I worked with a 9-year-old child before who had a diagnosis of ADHD. I'll call her Zara for this video. So when Zara's mum was going through the process of telling her about her diagnosis, she was worried about how Zara was going to react. Was she going to be using it as an excuse as to why she couldn't do things or wouldn't be able to do more in class? Would Zara be afraid of what her friends would say? So those kind of fears were coming up, and her mum was surprised to see that Zara had picked up on quite a few things herself from her own observations that they had never talked about before. So it gave her a bit of reassurance that this was something that was going to be helpful for Zara, because it would give her more language and understanding around what was actually going on for her. So then when we think about what some of the kind of fears that can come up around this conversation are from a parent's point of view, sometimes we are afraid that if a child is given a diagnosis that it will be used as an excuse. For example, similar to what that example I just gave now with Zara, that the child might use that as a reason why they shouldn't try anymore. Whereas actually, when we set things up in a frame where we normalise that the difficulty is there for the child, we're actually moving them away from that. We're moving them away from having their diagnosis act as a reason not to do something, and highlighting to them what they can do, and that although you are finding this situation difficult at times, it doesn't mean that we can't use strategies and techniques to help overcome some of these barriers. And yes, you might have to try a bit harder in that situation or that particular lesson, for example, in school. You might find it more difficult to focus, for example, but you have to try, and we have to work together so that you're doing your best in school. So we won't be using it as a label or an excuse to not do something or not to try. Parents, I think, as well, are worried about how a child's will their child worry about telling the wider class group, or will there be a reaction from their friends? And again, we need to take that seriously, because that's a genuine fear that a child will have, that how their classmates may react to things. So when we are discussing things with them, we can talk through about how the diagnosis is affecting how their brain is working. And we can also say that when you're ready, you can tell whoever you want. It's not going to be broadcasted around the classroom, but it is good for other people to understand you better. And sometimes when we open up about things, we are surprised that other people are actually having similar experiences, or other children might be finding that they have difficulties in other areas that you don't have difficulties in. So again, it's about trying to get your child to see how common some of these things are, and that it's to help them to feel more calm and relaxed about the whole thing, and that maybe their friends will be a source of support in the future rather than something to worry about. So then if we think about some of the other fears that can come up, children might attach labels to themselves, like I'm not as smart as someone else, or that's something that's broken in me. And we want to move them away from that language. Obviously, we want to talk about things in a more positive and balanced way. And we will talk about that specifically in a few minutes, about how to frame things. And parents are also maybe a bit worried that they won't have the right words to say things. So we have to think about the type of language that we use, and not using lots of kind of complicated or abstract terminology that the child might not have heard before. When we're explaining things, we want to keep the language simple and age appropriate for that child. So when we talk about how or what's a good way to approach this, initially it's good to highlight a child's strength to them. So you have been given a diagnosis of ADHD, and what does that mean? Well, I know this about you. You're really good at doing PE lessons. You're doing so really well in following instructions from your football coach or in the swimming lesson. That's something that is really easy for you to do, and it's one of your strengths. Or you're very caring with a sibling, or whatever those strengths are. It's good to highlight to your child what you can see in them as a strength, and help them to label those things for themselves as well. So we want to try and start off with some positive language about them as a person. And then when we're telling them what ADHD is, for example, we want to use concrete language. As I mentioned, avoiding using jargon like it's a neurodevelopmental or biological. Some of that terminology might be a little bit abstract depending on your child's age, obviously, but trying to keep things in easy to understand language is best. And sometimes analogies can help as well. I find that analogies are really helpful because it removes the abstractness of when we use certain words, and it helps children to immediately identify with what the image that's been represented to them. So for ADHD, we might use an analogy of your brain is like a car that's driving really fast. I want to help you now by working with you so that we can identify when we need to put the brakes on, when do we need to slow things down. So that helps the child to understand that their brain is working in a slightly different way to other people. And because you've started off by explaining their strengths, then when you start to introduce terminology, they're able to see, oh yeah, that's where my brain differs to someone else. If you're discussing a diagnosis of autism with a child, and your child has sensory sensitivities in particular, that's something that they're struggling with, you might say to them, your brain is like a really hyper-focused camera, and the microphone picks up on sounds and the camera picks up on light in a way that's to a higher level than your friends do. And that's why some of the things in the environment can be overwhelming at times. Or if your child has social communication struggles at school, for example, we could use the analogy of a second language and a first language. So you might say to your child, your first language is clear and direct, and you do so well with speaking your mind and getting your point across. Where sometimes we can struggle is that with the second language, then it's about looking at things like someone's reaction, taking their perspective by looking at their body language and the subtle cues and clues that we get from how they're engaging with us. And at the moment, you're finding it a bit difficult to switch between your first language and your second language. And this is something that we're going to work on together. So it's good to have a think about maybe use of an analogy to help your child to understand from their perspective how this impacts them and how it explains how their brain is working. And then if we think about exactly what to say, so I'm going to read this out to make sure that I get the language correct myself, and we will adapt it depending on the child's age. So for a younger child, we want to keep things short and concrete, and keep it in one sitting together. So we want to try and keep it to the point as well and not overload them. And we might say something like, you know how everyone's brain works a bit differently. Yours is really good at noticing things and coming up with ideas quickly. And it also finds it harder to sit still and wait. That's called ADHD. Lots of children have it, and there are things we're going to learn together that'll help. So what I'm not doing is over explaining things. I'm trying to give them some of the basics of the main points that I need to get across, and giving some reassurance as well that we're going to work through these things together. For a slightly older child, for example, a child aged Zara's age, so maybe age 9 to 12, we might say something like, you know how you've told me reading feelings is really tiring and sitting through long lessons feels almost impossible some days. We found out why, and it's called ADHD. And it means your brain manages attention and energy differently to a lot of your friends' brains. It's not something you're doing wrong, it's just how your brain is built. And now that we know, we can find the exact things that help you. And what we're doing there is giving a bit more detailed explanation than we've given to a younger child. We're giving them more examples of what they can see maybe in their everyday environment, and giving them the space then to come up with their own input as to what they feel like it looks like for them as well. Because they're a bit older, then it'll be a bit easier for them to be able to see how this is showing up for them in their day-to-day life. For a teenager then, we can be a bit more direct. We don't need to maybe use as much analogy-based language or metaphors, and we can see them more as like a conversation partner in the discussion. So what we might say is that I want to talk to you about the assessment that we did recently, and the results have come back to say that you have ADHD. So before I say anything else, what have you noticed yourself and what questions do you have? So when we do that, then we're putting it back on them and showing them that we respect and value their input and what they think about the whole situation. We can also ask them, are you surprised to get this information? Were you expecting it? What do you think yourself? And where do you think this is affecting you? So giving them the space to be able to give their input in a more detailed way. And then something that it can also help is to talk about how some of the symptoms or that you discuss can affect you as well as their parent, to normalize things around the whole conversation. For example, you might say, yeah, I can see that sometimes your focus is really good in certain activities that I know that you're interested in, for example, or you find more stimulating. But then when we shift to doing some other activities, your focus and attention is not as consistent. That happens for me too. For example, when you can see that I am really conscious of being on time for things, but then when it comes down to it, I'm often late. That's why I've been to collect you from your football, for example. And even when I'm organised, I seem to always be in a rush at the last minute because I forget things that I should have done earlier. And then that can cause some stress for me, and I can sometimes overreact to things. So you're trying to make it really visible and easy for them to see it in you, and then it helps to normalise the whole conversation around what ADHD is and what it looks like for both your child and for you, and it gives them the space then to be, applying it to themselves as well. And what we want to try and avoid doing as well around this time that we set aside to explain a diagnosis to your child is not to do it when they're tired or dysregulated, maybe after school when they've had a long day and they've had a lot of cognitive load put on them across the morning, for example. And you know that when they come in from school, they need their time to decompress and have a bit of quiet time. or to maybe it's playing computer games or go out and play football for an hour, whatever that activity is, that isn't probably the best time to do it. If they've just had an outburst, or it could be maybe later at night, in the evening time, maybe that's not the best time to do it either. So have a think about when you feel that they'll be better able to take the news on board, and they'll be not as tired. So then at least you're giving them that, the resources to be able to listen and take things in a bit more effectively as well that way. We also then want to, as I mentioned, avoid using like technical jargon language and keep things as age appropriate in terms of how we explain it, but not overloading them. And we don't want to think that this is going to be a one-off conversation. It's going to be an ongoing process of your child getting to grips with things. They might go back and have a think themselves, then come back to you and have some more questions. So what we're doing is bringing up the topic and be ready that it's going to be an ongoing conversation. And as I mentioned before, it highlights that we need to normalise the behaviours that we see across the day as much as we can, and comment on it so that it's not a big subject that's only kept at one time and it's a serious conversation that's not going to be brought up again. What we want to do is normalise it by showing that your child, that you yourself have some of the traits that you're discussing, and that this is part of everyday life. Sometimes as well, parents ask whether they should use another child as a point of reference. So maybe it's a friend or a sibling that also has a diagnosis. And it's important that we think about how we don't want to make the child's identity attach on to one person in particular, because often if we talk about a peer in the class, for example, it sets things up where your child might start comparing themselves to that person. And if I go back to the example of Zara, this was something that her mum reported back, that she came back and started saying, am I like this person in my class? So when we have that happen, it's okay, if they've come to you and said, oh, am I like that person? It's good to follow their lead a bit. What we want to do is to show them that there's lots of people that have this type of, learning way of learning. And there's lots of people whose brain works like this. If we even think about some famous people that have ADHD or dyslexia, or have autism, we can see lots of examples, of people that have it. So in doing that, then you're normalizing it and you're not attaching it to one person's behavior that they're very familiar with, because you want to give them the space to develop their own sense of who they are. And obviously, everyone's going to present in a different way. So by tagging themselves alongside someone else, for example, a friend in their class, it runs the risk of them taking everything that person has, which may not apply to them. So again, it's good to just not use that as a strategy to explain. But if your child comes to you and asks if that means that they're like that person, we can remember to frame things in positive way as much as possible, and then try and get them to see that there is some similarities perhaps in how you look at things or how that person is experiencing things, but you're your own person, so everything is going to be slightly different, depending on our own strengths and weaknesses. And then what that does as well is gives your child the language to be able to speak up for themselves and advocate for themselves. So they might be better able to explain things to a friend in their class or a teacher at school, to be able to ask for what they need, because when we open up the conversation, then you can have that dialogue about what's working well for you, and how can we ask for that to be part of your school day. How can we ask for that movement break? How can we ask for that sensory break that is helping you to feel more calm and regulated then when you go back into the classroom? So by having these discussions, it gives children the space to learn how to talk about it themselves in an easy to understand way, and in a way that can help them when they're at school to talk through these things with other people. Yeah, I think that's probably the main things around language to use. I hope you found this content helpful. We also have some other videos that you're welcome to watch around just how to, communicate things in a neuroaffirmative way. That's another training piece that we have on the YouTube channel. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or send me a message, and I'd love to hear your feedback too. I hope that some of these strategies might make this whole process a bit less daunting for you when you're giving this news to your child.